When God appeared, the three prophets who saw God. What would it be like to stand in the presence of God, to glimpse His unimaginable power, His radiant glory, His overwhelming holiness? Would you tremble? Would you fall to your knees? Or would you, like many in the Bible, cry out in awe and fear, completely undone by His majesty? Throughout history, countless people have searched for God, but only a few have been granted the extraordinary privilege of seeing Him. Today, I want to take you on a journey, one that spans burning mountains, heavenly throne rooms, and visions too incredible for words. This is the story of three prophets: Moses, Isaiah, and Ezekiel. Three men who didn't just hear about God or sense His presence. They saw Him. They encountered Him face to face, or as close as any human could without being consumed by His glory. Think about it. These weren't superheroes or mythical figures. These were ordinary men chosen by an extraordinary God. Moses was a shepherd, Isaiah a reluctant prophet, and Ezekiel an exile living far from home. Yet, God revealed Himself to them in ways that shaped not only their lives, but the course of human history. And here's the big question I want you to think about as we dive in. What happens when a person sees God? How does it change them? How does it transform their purpose, their identity, their mission? Because here's the truth. When you truly encounter God, you cannot walk away the same. So, buckle up. This isn't just about ancient stories. It's about the eternal God who revealed Himself then and is still revealing Himself today. By the end of this journey, you'll see how these encounters speak to your life, your struggles, and your calling. Are you ready? Let's step into the fire, the throne room, and the whirlwind to meet the God who changes everything. Part 1. Moses, the burning bush, and Mount Sinai. Let's start with one of the most famous encounters with God in all of Scripture, Moses. You've heard his name, but do you know his story? A man who went from a life of luxury in Pharaoh's palace to a fugitive hiding in the wilderness. A man whose life seemed to have stalled, only to be reignited by an encounter that would change the world. Picture this. Moses is 80 years old. He's no longer the prince of Egypt. He's a shepherd, wandering the wilderness with his father-in-law's sheep. By all appearances, his life is insignificant. Forgotten. But God? God has other plans. One ordinary day, Moses sees something extraordinary. A bush engulfed in flames but not consumed. Intrigued, he steps closer. That's when it happens. A voice calls his name. "Moses, Moses," Moses replies. "Here I am." Stop for a moment. Think about this. The creator of the universe, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, calls this simple shepherd by name. Can you imagine how that must have felt? Terrifying, humbling, awe-inspiring. Moses, a man who probably thought his best days were behind him, is now standing on holy ground. Then comes the revelation. I am who I am. God reveals His identity, not as a distant force, but as the eternal, self-existent one. He tells Moses that he has heard the cries of his people, the Israelites, enslaved in Egypt. And now, Moses is the man chosen to lead them to freedom. But Moses, he hesitates, he questions, he doubts himself. He says, "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh?" Isn't that relatable? How often do we feel unworthy when God calls us to something greater? Yet God reassures him, "I will be with you." Here's the lesson. God doesn't call the qualified. He qualifies the called. Fast forward. Moses has led the Israelites out of Egypt through the power of God's mighty hand. Now they're at Mount Sinai. It's here that Moses will encounter God in a way that no one else ever has. The mountain is covered in smoke, fire, and thunder. The sound of a trumpet grows louder and louder, shaking the earth. The people tremble in fear. But Moses, he ascends into the presence of God. For 40 days and 40 nights, Moses is on the mountain, receiving the 10 Commandments and instructions for God's covenant with his people. But even after all of this, Moses dares to ask for more. He says, "Show me your glory." Can you imagine that? Moses has seen plagues, miracles, and God parting the Red Sea, but he's not satisfied. He wants to see God in his fullness. And God, in his mercy, agrees, but with a condition. "You cannot see my face, for no one may see me and live." So God hides Moses in the cleft of a rock and covers him with his hand as his glory passes by. Moses sees God's back, just a glimpse, but it's enough to leave him radiant. When he comes down from the mountain, his face is shining so brightly that the people can't even look at him. Moses' story is a reminder that God reveals himself to those who seek him. It's also a call to boldness. Moses wasn't content with the miracles or the signs. He wanted to know God intimately. And that's the challenge for us today. Are we willing to ask for more of God? To say, "Show me your glory," even when it means stepping out of our comfort zones. Moses wasn't perfect. He doubted. He argued with God. But his encounters with the Almighty transformed him into one of the greatest leaders in history. And here's the takeaway. If God can use a shepherd in the wilderness to change the world, imagine what he can do with you. Let that sink in as we move to our next prophet, Isaiah, who experienced the overwhelming holiness of God in the throne room of heaven. Stay with me. This journey is just getting started. Part 2. Isaiah, the vision of the throne room. Let's step into the next incredible encounter. This time, we meet Isaiah, a man who didn't just hear about God's holiness, he saw it. And when he did, it absolutely wrecked him. If Moses' encounter was about God's power and glory, Isaiah's is about God's unimaginable holiness. It's the year that King Uzziah dies. For over 50 years, Uzziah had been a strong ruler, but now the throne is empty and the nation is in turmoil. Isaiah, a prophet called to speak to a rebellious people, finds himself in a moment of uncertainty. The earthly king is gone. What's going to happen now? Where is God in all of this? But instead of despair, Isaiah is about to get an answer that will forever change how he sees God, himself, and his mission. Suddenly, Isaiah is transported into a vision, and what he sees is beyond comprehension. "I saw the Lord high and exalted, seated on a throne, and the train of his robe filled the temple." Isaiah 6:1. Let's pause here. The Lord, the King of Kings, is seated on a throne that towers above everything. His robe isn't just long, it fills the entire temple. Every detail screams of his majesty and authority. This is not just any king, this is the King. But that's not all. Surrounding the throne are seraphim, angelic beings unlike anything Isaiah or we could ever imagine. They have 6 wings, 2 to cover their faces, 2 to cover their feet, and 2 to fly. Even they, in their purity, cannot look directly at God. And what are they saying? Over and over, they cry, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord Almighty. The whole earth is full of His glory." Do you feel the weight of those words? Not just holy. Holy, holy, holy. In Hebrew, repeating something 3 times means it's absolute. God's holiness is beyond measure, beyond comprehension. It's who He is. As Isaiah takes this in, he doesn't celebrate or feel honored. Instead, he's crushed. He cries out, "Woe to me! I am ruined, for I am a man of unclean lips, and I live among a people of unclean lips, and my eyes have seen the King, the Lord Almighty." Isaiah, a prophet, someone who speaks on behalf of God, is completely undone. Why? Because in the light of God's holiness, he sees the depth of his own sin, and not just his. He sees the brokenness of his entire nation. Here's the truth. When we truly encounter God's holiness, it exposes everything. Our pride, our sin, our inadequacy. But here's the beauty. It doesn't end there. As Isaiah stands there, overwhelmed by his unworthiness, one of the seraphim flies to him. In its hand is a live coal taken from the altar. The seraph touches Isaiah's lips with the coal and says, "See, this has touched your lips. Your guilt is taken away, and your sin atoned for." Do you see what's happening? God doesn't leave Isaiah in his guilt. He cleanses him. He removes the sin that separates Isaiah from him. It's a foreshadowing of what Jesus would ultimately do for all of us. And then comes the call. God asks, "Whom shall I send? And who will go for us?" Isaiah, now cleansed and forgiven, doesn't hesitate. He says, "Here am I. Send me." Think about that. A man who moments ago felt utterly unworthy now stands ready to be God's messenger. That's what happens when we encounter the holiness of God. It doesn't just reveal our sin, it transforms us for His purpose. Isaiah's vision gives us a few powerful takeaways. 1. God's holiness is overwhelming. The cry of the seraphim, the sheer awe of the throne room, everything points to God's absolute purity and greatness. This is the God we serve, and He deserves nothing less than our reverence. 2. Humility leads to transformation. Isaiah's response, "Woe is me," shows the importance of acknowledging our sin. It's only when we humble ourselves before God that He can cleanse us and use us. 3. God calls the cleansed. Isaiah's commissioning came after his cleansing. In the same way, God prepares and equips us for His purposes when we surrender to Him. 4. Say yes to the call. Isaiah's willingness to say, "Here am I, send me," is a challenge to all of us. God is still asking, "Whom shall I send?" Are you ready to answer? Isaiah's encounter didn't just change his life, it changed his nation. He became one of the most influential prophets in history, speaking of both judgment and the coming Messiah. And it all began with a vision of God's holiness. Now let's move to our final prophet, Ezekiel, whose visions of God were so extraordinary they almost defy description. Stick with me. This next part will blow your mind. Part 3, Ezekiel, Visions of God's Glory. We've seen Moses encounter God in fire and glory. We've walked with Isaiah into the throne room, overwhelmed by holiness. But now we step into the extraordinary, the unimaginable, the visions of Ezekiel. His encounters with God are some of the most vivid and mysterious in all of Scripture. If Moses saw God's power and Isaiah His holiness, Ezekiel witnessed His unstoppable glory, a glory so profound it shook the heavens and the earth. Let's set the scene. Ezekiel is no stranger to hardship. He's living in Babylon, far from the land of Israel, far from the temple where God's presence once dwelled. The people are broken, defeated, and hopeless. Their sin has brought them into exile, and they wonder, has God abandoned us? In the midst of this despair, God doesn't leave Ezekiel or his people in silence. He gives Ezekiel visions, visions that reveal his power, his justice, and his plan to restore hope. Imagine this. Ezekiel is by the Kibar River when suddenly the heavens open. A stormy wind rushes in, accompanied by an immense cloud filled with fire. And in the center of the fire is something like glowing metal. But that's just the beginning. Ezekiel sees 4 living creatures, unlike anything you've ever imagined. Each one has 4 faces, of a human, a lion, an ox, and an eagle. They have wings that stretch out and touch one another, and beneath them are wheels. These aren't ordinary wheels. They're wheels within wheels that sparkle like precious stones and move in any direction without turning. And above it all, a throne of sapphire, radiant and awe-inspiring. Sitting on that throne is someone who looks like a human figure, blazing with fire and encircled by a rainbow that radiates God's glory. Ezekiel falls face down in reverence. Let's pause. This isn't just a strange, otherworldly vision. It's a revelation of God's sovereignty. The chariot represents God's presence, his ability to go anywhere, even into exile with his people. Those wheels, they remind us that God's plans are unstoppable. Nothing, no nation, no power, no circumstance can thwart his will. Ezekiel's second major vision is heartbreaking. He's transported in the spirit to the temple in Jerusalem. This was the place where God's presence once dwelled, where the people worshipped him. But what does Ezekiel see? Sin and idolatry, corruption. The temple has become defiled, and the people have turned their backs on God. Then comes the unthinkable. Ezekiel witnesses the Giti glory of the Lord, the very presence of God, rising up from the temple and departing. Imagine the sorrow of seeing God's glory leave his people. It's a powerful statement of judgment, a sign that God will not dwell where he is rejected. But even in judgment, there's hope. God promises to bring his people back, to give them a new heart and a new spirit. He will restore what was broken. His glory will return. Let's move forward to one of Ezekiel's most famous visions, the Valley of Dry Bones. God takes Ezekiel to a valley filled with bones, dry and lifeless. He asks, "Son of man, can these bones live?" Ezekiel answers wisely, "Sovereign Lord, you alone know." Then God tells Ezekiel to prophesy over the bones. As he does, something miraculous happens. The bones begin to rattle and come together. Flesh covers them. Breath enters them. And suddenly, an army of living, breathing people stands before him. What does this mean? It's a powerful symbol of God's ability to bring life out of death, to restore hope to the hopeless. For the exiled Israelites, it was a promise that God wasn't finished with them. For us, it's a reminder that no situation is beyond God's power to redeem. Finally, Ezekiel sees a vision of the future, a time when God's glory returns to a new temple. He describes it in breathtaking detail. The radiance, the overwhelming presence of God filling the space once again. It's a promise of restoration, a glimpse of what's to come when God's kingdom is fully established. Ezekiel's visions may seem otherworldly, but they hold timeless truths. 1. God's glory is unstoppable. From the chariot to the return of his glory, Ezekiel's visions remind us that God's presence isn't confined to a place. He is with his people, even in the darkest times. 2. Judgment leads to redemption. The departure of God's glory from the temple was heartbreaking, but it paved the way for his restoration. God's discipline is never without purpose. It's meant to bring us back to Him. 3. God brings life to what is dead. The valley of dry bones is a powerful reminder that God can breathe life into the most hopeless situations. No matter how broken or lifeless something seems, God can restore it. 4. Hope is anchored in God's promises. Ezekiel's visions point to a future where God's glory will dwell with His people forever. This hope isn't just for Ezekiel's time, it's for ours too. Ezekiel's encounters with God are a testament to His power, His justice, and His relentless love for His people. They show us that no matter how far we've strayed, no matter how broken we feel, God's glory is never out of reach. Now, as we wrap up this incredible journey through the lives of these 3 prophets, let's pull everything together. Stick with me. There's still so much to uncover. Part 4. Common themes and key lessons. We've walked through fire with Moses, stood in awe with Isaiah, and been overwhelmed by Ezekiel's extraordinary visions. Each of these encounters is unique, yet they share profound truths that resonate not just in the lives of these prophets, but in ours as well. So what does it all mean? What can we learn from these glimpses of God's power, holiness, and glory? Let's bring it all together. Point 1. The holiness of God demands reverence. If there's one thing that stands out in all 3 encounters, it's this: God is holy. And His holiness isn't just a trait, it's His very essence. Moses removed his sandals at the burning bush because he was on holy ground. Isaiah cried, "Woe is me," when faced with the absolute purity of God's throne room. Ezekiel fell face down when he saw God's glory in the chariot of fire. God's holiness is not something we can approach casually. It demands reverence, humility, and awe. And yet, He invites us to come closer. He doesn't reveal His holiness to intimidate us, but to transform us. Ask yourself, how do you respond to the holiness of God? Does it drive you to your knees in worship? Or have you become too comfortable with the idea of Him? Let these stories remind you, God isn't just our friend or helper. He is the Holy One, the Lord Almighty, worthy of all honor. Year. 2. God's presence transforms us. No one sees God and remains the same. Moses, Isaiah, and Ezekiel were forever changed by their encounters. Moses became the leader who freed a nation. Isaiah was purified and empowered to deliver God's message. Ezekiel carried hope and restoration to a people in despair. God doesn't reveal Himself to us just to give us a good story. His presence changes us, our hearts, our purpose, our very identity. And He's still in the business of transformation today. Maybe you feel stuck, unworthy, or like your life is insignificant. But if God can use a shepherd, a timid prophet, and an exile, He can use you. The question is, are you willing to be transformed? Are you ready to let God shape you for His purposes? Thought. 3. God's call requires courage and obedience. Each of these prophets was called to something daunting. Moses had to face Pharaoh, the most powerful man in the world, with nothing but a staff and God's promise. Isaiah was sent to a rebellious nation with a message of judgment and hope. Ezekiel had to proclaim God's words in exile, often through strange and challenging acts. Here's the truth. God's call is rarely easy. It's not about comfort or convenience. It's about obedience. But here's the good news. When God calls, He equips. He doesn't leave us to figure it out on our own. He goes with us, just as He promised Moses. I will be with you. Maybe God is calling you to something right now. It might feel overwhelming, even impossible. But take heart. He will give you the courage and strength you need. Your job is to say yes. 4. God's glory is unstoppable. One of the most powerful themes in these encounters is the sheer, unstoppable nature of God's glory. It moves, it shakes, it fills everything it touches. From the fire on Mount Sinai to the throne room in Isaiah's vision to the chariot in Ezekiel's, God's glory is a force that cannot be contained or diminished. Even when it seems like everything is falling apart, as it did for the Israelites in exile, God's glory remains. It departs the temple in Ezekiel's vision, but it's not gone forever. It returns, stronger and more radiant, pointing to the ultimate restoration through Christ. No matter how dark the world feels, no matter how hopeless things seem, God's glory is still moving, and one day we'll see it in its fullness. 5. Encountering God is both terrifying and life-giving. Let's be honest, seeing God is not a comfortable experience. It's overwhelming, humbling, and even terrifying. But it's also life-giving. Moses saw God's glory and became the leader of a nation. Isaiah's lips were cleansed, and he became the mouthpiece of God. Ezekiel saw visions of hope that sustained him and his people. The fear of God is not the kind of fear that makes you run away. It's the kind that draws you closer, knowing that in His presence there is life, peace, and purpose. So don't be afraid to seek Him, even if it's intimidating. God reveals Himself to those who are willing to come near. 6. God's story is about redemption. Each of these encounters is part of a bigger story, a story of redemption. Moses led the Israelites out of slavery, foreshadowing Christ's ultimate deliverance from sin. Isaiah pointed to the coming Messiah, the one who would bear our sins and bring us peace. Ezekiel's visions promised restoration and the return of God's glory. God's purpose is always redemption. No matter how far we've fallen, no matter how broken we feel, His plan is to restore us. And here's the amazing part. He invites us to be part of that story. He calls us to be agents of His redemption in the world. So what about you? You've heard these stories. You've seen how God revealed Himself to Moses, Isaiah, and Ezekiel. But this isn't just about them. It's about you. God is still speaking. He's still revealing His glory. And He's still calling people to join Him in His work. What would it look like for you to say, "Here I am, send me"? What would it mean to step into the fire, to stand in awe of His holiness, to let His glory transform your life? Here's the truth. God doesn't just want to be part of your story. He wants to write it. Are you ready to let Him? As we wrap up this journey, remember this. The same God who revealed Himself to Moses, Isaiah, and Ezekiel is the same God who invites you into His presence today. Seek Him with all your heart. Be bold enough to ask, "Show me your glory." And when He calls, answer with courage, knowing that your life will never be the same. God's glory is waiting. The question is, will you step into it?